you so much. I'm so sorry that circumstances prevent me from being with you in person. I have wonderful memories of a previous visit to Denmark, a few days in Copenhagen, staying at Tom and Runa's house, eating smørrebrød, and hopefully one of these days I will, someday soon I'll be able to return with my wife and family. The plan I have for the next few days is to put it very simply, is to solve a problem. So think of it as a problem-solving session in a way. But it's a big problem that I'm trying to solve. And the problem has something to do, a lot to do with a word I'm going to use a lot, which is narratives. The problem which I will try to solve is the modern day's lack of a guiding narrative and the difficulty that we have of finding a suitable narrative for the present and for the future. And so that's kind of in one sentence what I'll be planning. In the first day, in this first session, I'll be talking, it's really setting up the problem, I suppose. And then in the sessions to follow, I'll be outlining elements in what I feel can be a solution. The overarching problem, and also I want to say, although I might not be paying close attention to the chat panel as I'm speaking, I do want to invite comment and question as I go. I won't be, too disturbed or disrupted if you want to ask a question for clarification as I'm moving along. So please feel free to do that. The point I want to start at is what we might call the vortex of the present. There is I think a pervasive sense that I don't need to explain in great detail that things are falling apart, that there is almost like we're caught in some sort of whirlwind. And although we expected perhaps things to always be getting better, we expect tomorrow always to be better than yesterday. We have this idea in our minds that that history is driven by the idea of progress, and that which is almost a law of nature, that we're moving in a good direction. And over the last few years, even decade or two, I think a lot of very observant people might look at the world and say, well, this idea that history is moving in this direction of in a good direction isn't necessarily the case. It's possible that things can just get worse, and maybe that's just the way of things, as a sort of competing way of looking at the world, than this idea that things are always going to get better. We look around and we see, contrary to our expectation, almost a rise in various kinds of tribalisms, a rise in a very insular nationalism, a seeming rise in injustices of various kinds, racial injustices, a widening of gap, the chasm really between the haves and the have-nots, a growing recognition of the deep realities, at least speaking as a US citizen, deep realities of institutional racism, a growing awareness of the delicate state that our global environment is in, a growing recognition that we may be on the verge of significant climate change and environmental collapse. We're, of course, in the midst of a global pandemic that I don't need to go into much detail about. All of this is contributing to a widespread sense of hopelessness among some as to the future state of the world. At the same time, one can look at the world and see it through a very different lens. One can look at the world and see it instead of through the lens of hopelessness, the lens of decline, the lens of things falling apart. One can look at the world through the lens of progress, and one can see so many things to take hope in. The incredibly rapid advance in our material circumstances, perhaps most spectacularly seen in the advance of technologies, computer technologies, which are making our lives better and easier in so many ways. Advances in the sciences and the science of medicine, eliminating diseases that had ravaged humanity in the past. One can take that lens, and I can do no better than recommend books by Steven Pinker on this very subject, who goes against this sort of trend of moroseness, I suppose, in evaluating the present day. In books called Better Angels and Enlightenment Now, making the counter argument that actually things are pretty good, statistically speaking, that if things appear to be getting worse, it's more because the media is making it seem that way. It's because we have these enormous megaphones to broadcast every least injustice. And so we end up focusing on the bad instead of the good. But I think in support for Steven Pinker's view of progress being actually a thing, of civilization actually moving in a good direction, the Baha'i writings themselves are, I think, very much side with this idea that we are on the cusp of a great new age of humanity. Abdu'l-Baha, speaking in London in 1911 in one of his very first talks in the West, this is in Abdu'l-Baha in London, page 19, he says, "This is a new cycle of human power. All the horizons of the world are luminous, and the world will become indeed as a garden and a paradise. It is the hour of unity of the sons of men and of the drawing together of all races and classes. You are loosed from ancient superstitions which have kept men ignorant, destroying the foundation of true humanity." I mean, one could pick literally dozens of passages from the Baha'i writings that extol the greatness of this day and refer to the great technological advances and the cultural advances and so forth. But the problem, though, is that in the midst of this, we're also in the midst of a period of overwhelming change. Social norms and mores are changing rapidly. We are overwhelmed by information with no clear way to interpret that information. It reminds me of the statement of Abdu'l-Baha in his book of Certitude, where he describes the oppression of that age, and he gives a kind of surprising definition of oppression. One thinks of oppression as being oppressed by someone. And Abdu'l-Baha in the first part of the book of Certitude on paragraph 29 says, "What oppression is more grievous than that a soul seeking the truth and wishing to attain unto the knowledge of God should know not where to go for it and from whom to seek it?" So our very success in creating these enormous volumes of information and having access to information on a scale that previous generations could hardly imagine. If one has no way of sifting that information, if one doesn't have a narrative framework in which to put it, if one doesn't know how to evaluate what bits of information that are being delivered to us are true and which are false, then one ends up in a sort of state of confusion, of perpetual cognitive dissonance. And this cognitive dissonance is heightened by the existence, also created by the very technology that could bring us together, the technology of social media. That technology is at the same time creating these echo chambers in which competing voices can talk entirely past each other. And one can dip into one echo chamber and get a certain take on things, and then dip inside a different echo chamber, which is taking the same observation of the same world, access to the same information, but is interpreting it in a completely different way. And one is seeing this, I think, throughout the world. And speaking as, again, as a US citizen, I'm seeing this in a very distressing way in the discourse that's taking place within my country. And I think behind this cognitive dissonance and behind this sort of confusion at this overwhelming massive information, but really no way to interpret it, behind this confusion is what I will call a collapse of narratives, a collapse of systems of thought that have traditionally given meaning and context to our lives. And I'll give a few examples of the narratives that I'm talking about that the present day is bereft of. And perhaps the biggest narrative, and this is the real, I think, the real elephant in the room, is the collapse of traditional religious narratives of all the great world religions that have traditionally given meaning and context to human life. They have given us an image of where we are in relation to the divine, that we are born into an earthly state with the purpose of transcending that earthly state, acquiring virtues, attaining the city of heaven. There was almost as though we're born into a house with two floors, that there's the material floor and dimension, and then above that is the spiritual dimension. And it is our collective, individual and collective destiny to transcend the limitations of the ground floor into which we're born, and attain to spirituality. And all the different religions of the world, whether of the East or the West, have this similar kind of two-floor narrative, that there is a spiritual purpose and dimension to human existence. This twofold structure is in a state of collapse. The two stories have been in kind of slow motion over the last several centuries, been collapsing into one story. And this collapse of this old two-story way of looking at the world has been diagnosed by different philosophers over time. Perhaps very famously by Friedrich Nietzsche in the 1800s, in the later 1800s. And he said it in very provocative terms by saying God is dead. We have killed him. That and implicit in this declaration is, I think, the movement of history over the last several centuries that really began with the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the European Enlightenment, that brought a new way of thinking into the world, a scientific way of thinking that began to challenge the traditional religious narratives, that began to challenge the way of thinking about the world, that very simply split it into a material dimension and a spiritual dimension. And as the scientific narrative, as the the predictive power of the scientific narrative began to expand as we began to understand more of the world around us, and as this understanding began to prove itself by all of the great advances in technology that came with the advance of science. It's as though the space for the operation of those spiritual forces, which were thought to be the true ordering principles in the world, began to shrink. It's as though we had previously thought of God as existing and operating in some invisible realm, somewhere in the gaps of our knowledge. That's where the spiritual forces are, the God of the gaps. But as these gaps of our knowledge shrink because our understanding of the physical world expands, the space for the operation of spiritual forces becomes more and more constricted, until in the present day one can say that it's essentially vanished. There are very few places left where one could find room for the operation of some invisible spiritual force in the world without it somehow being detectable through scientific instrumentation. Of course, mysteries do remain. The scientific method and the scientific, the combined efforts of scientists over generations have still been unable to fully explain the mysteries of both the origin of creation, the origin of life, and the origin of consciousness. One can say these are three of the great mysteries, gaps that remain, if one wished to still insert a sort of God of the gaps like sort of traditional understanding into things. But by and large, the explanatory power of science has led to a collapse of this two-story structure. And apart from that, our understanding of the true vastness and wonder of the cosmos, and I say this with with an astronomy background, astrophysics background. I've always been struck, from the time I was a very small child, very struck at the true scale and scope of the cosmos, and how that ultimately shows up the puniness, the very provincial nature of most of our ideas about the world. So as a result, and this is, I think, a very, very poor way of explaining it. But the basic point I want to make is that the traditional religious narrative has largely lost its power in the modern world. So modern world, certainly in the secular centers of power and wealth, has largely been drained of the sense of the sacred. Of course, it remains in other parts of the world. We can't generalize and say that that it's vanished in every place equally. And actually, this was, I think, very brilliantly described by the sociologist Peter Berger in a book he wrote called A Rumor of Angels. And he's describing this kind of slow motion collapse of this old narrative in the following terms. He said, "It would be extraordinarily naive to expect the demise of the supernatural to be equally visible from all vantage points of our culture, or to be experienced in the same way by all who have taken cognizance of it. There continue to be religions and theological milieux in which the crisis is, at the most, dimly sensed as an external threat in the distance. In other milieux, the crisis is beginning to be felt, but is still on its way. In yet other milieux, the crisis is in full eruption as a threat deep inside the fabric of religious practice, faith, and thought. And in some places, it is as if the believer or theologian were standing in a landscape of smoldering ruins." I think that well describes the situation of belief in God in this day. There are still communities where it seems very strong, where the encroaching forces of secularism and of secular approaches are still somewhere at the fringes, have not yet really reached the center. But in other parts of the world, all we have left of traditional theologies are smoking ruins. But the scientific narrative, which was intended to replace the traditional religious narrative, you know, if the Enlightenment project was to be fully realized, the scientific narrative, or let's say the secular narrative, has itself also collapsed in the present day in a certain way. It has its material promises have in some ways been unfulfilled. Of course, we're as I mentioned earlier, standing in the midst of this breathtaking progress in science and technology. But the promise of reason and the technology that it brings also brings terrible things with it. The scientific racism of the European Enlightenment that helped to construct racial categories that still persist today, you know, based upon reason at the time, based upon the best science of the day. Our ability to produce ever more terrifying means of destroying large numbers of people, of cities, nuclear energy turned to destructive ends. There are ways in which the advance of science and technology have brought great risk and potentially destruction of the human race on the planet. There have also been, I think, further to the unfulfilled promises of the secular points of view. I think it's more and more widely acknowledged that there's been a failure of the ideologies on both the left and the right, moving from science more into the political and economic realm. You know, on the left, the failure of the communist experiment. On the right, the failure of unregulated free markets, owing to their tendency to exacerbate inequalities. And there's also been a failure, I think, of a particular secular view that saw Western liberal democracy as the end of history, as representing the end of ideological evolution. That, you know, with the victory of the West over communism, we've reached a point where human progress has essentially reached its highest and ultimate goal. This was the thesis of Francis Fukuyama, not that many decades ago. But the rumors of the death of history, I think, are greatly exaggerated. There are also, I think, unfulfilled promises in the world of thought. You know, if it was the Enlightenment project to replace religious narratives with a narrative of pure reason that could understand and answer all of the questions of humanity, then it is, I think, demonstrably failed in that. I mean, just as one example, the philosopher David Chalmers took a poll. He sent out to other professional philosophers a poll as to what their stances are on certain basic philosophical questions. You know, monism versus dualism. You know, do you believe in God? Don't you believe in God? All of the fundamental questions that were, in many cases, defined by Plato 2,500 years ago. And he got the results of this poll, and he found that, you know, among professional philosophers of the day, there was essentially no agreement on any of the big questions. Abdu'l-Baha said this also, I think, quite eloquently, where he talks about the inability of philosophy alone to reach at the truth. The idea that reason could answer the the great questions, I think has taken a great hit in modern times. And then the narrative that was supposed to replace these two narratives, the narrative of science, the narrative of religion, both of which have in some ways reached their limits or have seen declines in the modern age, is the postmodernist narrative, a narrative fundamentally of suspicion that suspects ulterior motives behind any other grand narratives. It announces the death of all grand narratives, states ultimately that there is no underlying truth, at least that we have any access to, but that anything that we call the truth or any frameworks of truth that we build for ourselves is really just power struggles all the way down. That words, language, a word in a language doesn't pin itself onto any underlying reality, but that words are simply infinitely self-referential. The postmodernism, which really peaked just a few decades ago, I think is helpfully clears away the forest, I suppose, like a wildfire, helpfully clears away the forest of the useless weeds by trashing the narratives that came before. But it by its own nature is unable to create a narrative to replace it. This is just a few examples, sort of faltering examples of to try to put together an image, to leave you with an image of a modern world which seems exhausted of even the idea of any ultimate set of guiding principles. Religion as a political, social force, as a force in people's lives, seems to have failed. Even the replacement narrative, the secular narrative of science, also unable to answer and solve the great problems of humanity. What we're left with is really no narrative at all. And when there's no narrative at all, there's just the struggle for survival, materialistic pursuits. The situation was brilliantly skewered by Alan Watts in the 1960s, I think, in a book he wrote called The Book. And he describes sort of what we're left with once all the narratives have vacated the premises. What we're left with is basically an idea that we are defined by, as he puts it, defined as though we were all just digestive tracts walking around. This is how he puts it. Living organisms, including people, are merely tubes which put things in at one end and let them out at the other, which both keeps them doing it and in the long run wears them out. So, to keep the farce going, the tubes find ways of making new tubes, which also put things in at one end and let them out at the other. At the input end, they even develop ganglia of nerves called brains, with eyes and ears, so that they can more easily scrounge around for things to swallow. And when they get enough to eat, they use up their surplus energy by wiggling in complicated patterns, making all sorts of noises by blowing air in and out of the input hole, and gathering together in groups to fight with other groups. In time, the tubes grow such an abundance of attached appliances that they are hardly recognizable as mere tubes, and they manage to do this in a staggering variety of forms. There is a vague rule not to eat the tubes of your own form, but in general, there is serious competition as to who is going to be the top type of tube. All this seems marvelously futile, and yet when you begin to think about it, it begins to be more marvelous than futile. Indeed, it seems extremely odd. And one can dress up this, and this indeed is kind of what you're left with if there isn't a larger picture of what you're in the world for and what the ultimate purpose of life is. What you're left with is essentially what Alan Watts has described. We're simply physical beings reproducing ourselves, having experiences, maybe having the best experiences we can, maybe being the top type of tube within our own environment. And you can dress it up by making it appealing with all the appropriate advertising, but that fact remains. What I want to suggest, and where I want to go with all of this, introduction, is that we are on the cusp of, if we are, as the Baha'i writing state, upon the cusp of a new age, then a new kind of narrative has to go with it. And what is that new narrative going to be? Is it going to be simply taking out one of the old narratives and dusting them off and making them relevant again? Or will it in some way be an entirely new narrative that's fitting the particular needs of the day? Peter Berger, again, in A Rumor of Angels, talks about the cognitive dissonance of the believer in the modern world and what his options are. You know, a believer in the modern world facing this wall of skepticism as to the existence of those spiritual forces which the believer takes to be so fundamental. And Peter Berger says basically you're faced with three options. He says the first, and none of these options are good. He says the first option is defiance. So maintain a supernaturalist position in the teeth of an antagonistic and skeptical world. Say, well, science is just wrong about it, and at some point it'll be proven that all of the things that I believe in are actually true. The second possibility is surrender, a term that Berger likes to use, self-liquidation. He says the self-liquidation of all belief structures, the admission of the fundamentally superstitious nature of what one believed, and the full assimilation of the supernatural, of that second story of the building, into the realm of the natural. The third possible response to the overwhelming secularism of the modern day is what he calls accommodation, which is like a bargaining process with the modern world, figuring out which ideas you're going to keep, which you reject, but try to arrange it so that you get to keep the maximum number of ideas as you believed in them, and reject the minimum number of ideas that you're forced to reject. Like, okay, maybe the sun doesn't go around the earth, like they believed a few centuries ago, and it was the official position of my church, but I'm still going to believe in these other ideas. What I would suggest, and what I'll be delving into in the days to come, is a fourth possibility, which I would call reimagination, which is articulating a new narrative which will entail the definition of key components, redefinition and reuse of certain words, because we still have to use the same words in the language, but the words we're going to use may take on different meanings. And to just give a preview of a way in which we'll be using words in different ways, I'm using the word narrative a lot, but really a narrative is a word that In a scientific context, a narrative is a theory. It's a systematic way of understanding things. In a spiritual context, a narrative is a religion. We might call it perhaps a sacred narrative, but a narrative, a religion is a kind of narrative. The narratives that we take, narratives ultimately are, and I want to make this point, essentially human choices. They are adopted because they are useful for a particular end. That doesn't mean that all narratives are good, even if they are useful for a particular end. The end of some narratives may be, for example, to preserve the power of a ruling class or to keep a lower class in a state of oppression and subjugation. So some narratives may have been good in their time, may have accomplished certain ends in their time, but may no longer be in accordance with the needs and exigencies of the day. And it's also the case, I think, that more than one narrative may fit an existing set of facts. So when we ask ourselves about the kind of narrative that we need in the sort of amidst the smoldering ruins of the narratives of the past, what narrative fits the facts that are available to us? What narrative will fit those facts and will take us forward into the future? I think we have to acknowledge, and this is one of the fundamental points that I'll be returning to from different angles in the days to come. One of the fundamental things that we have to admit is that more than one narrative may fit an existing set of facts. We can all be looking at exactly the same thing and yet come to completely different conclusions about what that thing is. I want to give some just very sort of simple, almost trivial examples of that. And so I'll share my screen very briefly, if I'm allowed to. Am I sharing my screen now?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Sharing.
So some of you may have heard, these are memes, these are things that you may have already heard or seen, but I want you to listen to this audio clip and tell me what you hear.
He says yes, yes, yes.
So this kind of took the internet by storm a year, I guess a couple of years ago. You may have heard this. So how many of you heard the word laurel, and how many of you heard the word Yanni? There's probably some of you heard it one way and some of you heard it the other way. And the strange thing is, we're all hearing exactly the same thing.
The volume is really low on your
Oh, is the
YouTube,
volume too low to hear
you
it?
could almost not hear it.
Okay, thank you. Let me try it again. So, did you hear laurel or did you hear Yanni? I guess it's tough to. I heard
Yanni.
See, I hear laurel.
Definitely Yanni.
Yeah, I heard laurel.
Yanni.
Laura.
Yanni. I heard Yanni.
Yanni.
I also
Laurel.
Yeah.
I heard laurel.
Could you try it again?
Right?
Because we heard Yanni.
If we can hear, I mean, this is the simplest possible thing. You'd think that we could agree on what it is we're hearing, but you know, what is it about the you know, how our brains are already primed to hear certain things that means when we get this additional input, this is how we interpret it. And if it's the case for something as simple as this, how could it not be the case for things that are far more complex, things of far more import, where we're not even you know, in this case, it's reduced to the simplest possible. Okay, we're all hearing the same audio clip, but in life we don't have exactly the same input. You know, we'd like to think, okay, we're reading the same newspapers or we're listening to the same TV show, but we're interpreting the facts that are coming at us in very different ways. The same thing in the visual field. So is this dress black and blue, or is it white and gold?
White and gold.
White and gold.
White and gold.
Black and blue. Black and blue.
White and gold.
White and
Blue.
gold.
White and 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 gold.
So if you see it one way, it's almost impossible to see it the other way. Once you've seen it one way, to like see it in the other, you're like, I can't even imagine seeing it in the other way. This the same thing with Laurel Yanny. Similar, I mean, a similar thing. Everyone has seen this image at some point in their lives, I'm sure. What do you see? You know, do you see a young lady or an old woman or an old hag?
Young lady.
Young lady.
Young lady.
I see both.
Both.
I can see both. Old
Yeah, I
and
can see both.
I
young.
see both. I see
I
both.
can see young lady.
Both young
I see
lady and
lady.
old.
Both the young lady and an old lady.
Yeah, this is one for me. I can see both. For the black and blue dress or white and gold dress, I just can't see them both. This one I can kind of see them both at the same time, but still you get the idea that there are. And I'll stop sharing at this point. But so with things that are relatively simple, we have this intuition that there can be very different ways to interpret it.
Stephen, you're muted. You're muted
Yeah.
by accident.
Okay, unmuted. All right. So this insight that I think we all have, that even with the simplest sort of input, we can have completely different interpretations of it. We can take that insight and apply it to our understandings of religion, our understandings of big questions. Let me take maybe a more serious example. We all have access overall to the same fundamental facts about on a global scale as to, you know, is the population growing or shrinking? What are average life expectancies? What are the GDPs of different countries, and are they going up or down? There's certain fairly hard facts, I'll say fairly hard facts, that we all have access to. And so many beyond that. But there are those who take the facts available to us and they come to a conclusion that, well, it's a good thing that the world is becoming more global and connected. And for a large part of the population, and I suspect for certainly the great majority, overwhelming majority of the Baha'i population, we take that as a good thing. The world becoming more global and connected is a good thing. In fact, that's what we're all about. That's what we think the real purpose and direction of history is. But there's a growing number of people who, looking at the same set of facts, having access to the same information, are concluding completely the opposite. And they're saying, and they're focusing on different sets of facts. They're saying, well, actually, globalization is not necessarily a good thing. I mean, look at what it can do. The fact that you can get on an airplane and fly anywhere in a matter of hours also can spread viruses. So the fact that we're now suffering through a global pandemic is a consequence of the globalized nature of present-day society. There's a dark side to globalization. If people were confined more to their individual countries, if people were more inwardly looking, if people were more tribalistic, then a virus would have a much harder time jumping from one population to another. and things like global pandemics wouldn't be such a threat. There are also viruses of the mind. You know, the viruses of the mind I'm referring to, certain ideas that that appeal to the gravitational pull of the self, and the existence of these wonderful instruments of social media, which on the one hand enable us to connect with people all around the world in ways that would just have been inconceivable 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now you have all of the world connected in one big, sprawling, brawling conversation on, say, Twitter. What an amazing phenomenon. On the other hand, the very instrumentality which enables us to connect in this incredible way also allows us to create our own self-reinforcing echo chambers into which whatever ideas, whatever worldviews we had coming in are simply reinforced. We get stuck in these reinforcing loops that end up pulling us further and further into these ideological echo chambers. So which is it? You know, are these tools of globalization ultimately a good thing, or are they a bad thing? One can look at it from either perspective. In the theological domain, one of the core and central texts that I'll be coming back to, I think frequently in the next few days, is a set of 2 tablets that Baha'u'llah wrote to his old Zoroastrian friend, Manakji Sahib, with whom Baha'u'llah spent a time in Baghdad in the late 1850s, early 1860s. We don't know the exact years, but Manakji Sahib remained to the end of his life a Zoroastrian. He was a Parsi, but he was sympathetic to Baha'u'llah and was a friend of Baha'u'llah. And it represents for us a very unique situation of a sympathetic outsider asking Baha'u'llah questions, asking Baha'u'llah to describe and define his faith. And we get from Baha'u'llah in these tablets to this Zoroastrian Manakji Sahib a very different kind, a subtly, but I think very different kind of definition of what his cause is than how Baha'u'llah defines it to his own followers. I would suggest that what we're seeing is Baha'u'llah being able to maintain different narrative frameworks. There's a narrative framework that for those who, you know, for the vast majority of his followers coming from a Shiite Iranian background, that so often what Baha'u'llah writes is within that narrative framework. But when asked by his Zoroastrian friend questions about philosophical questions about the nature of his cause, Baha'u'llah responds in a different sort of narrative framework. One of the questions that was asked of Baha'u'llah, and there were 9 questions, I think, that his friend asked him. And these are in the book, The Tabernacle of Unity, fairly small volume, but I think, you know, way important, way out of proportion to its size in this conversation anyway. The second question of Baha'u'llah's Zoroastrian friend can be effectively translated into modern terms as a question about theological frameworks. And Manakji Sahib asked Baha'u'llah, he basically says that there are 4 schools of thought in the world, and asked Baha'u'llah to say which one of these schools of thought is the correct school. And you can guess I'm going to use the word narrative here and say, you know, these are 4 different narrative frameworks. They're all within the sort of the realm of how one thinks about ultimate reality. And the 4 different frameworks, as and I won't read because it's a very long paragraph, but this is this is in the Tabernacle of Unity, and it's the second tablet, and it's paragraph 6. That there are 4 schools of thought in the world, and just to briefly summarize it, Manashi Sahib asked Baha'u'llah to tell him which is the right way of thinking about the universe. Is it that God created the universe and sends prophets at regular intervals for the guidance of the creatures? That's one option. Another option is that, well, really God is the universe, that there's that the ultimate reality of things is the divine reality. And the third option is that God created the universe, but then doesn't really actively intervene in it, doesn't send prophets, but he's the ultimate creator of things. And then the fourth option, or the fourth school of thought, is effectively that, well, there really is there's talk of God is really just talk about power, that really the universe is just cycles of growth and decay. Yes, the prophets talk about God. Yes, the rulers and kings talk about God, but this is really just a way of getting stuff done. So one could further reduce this, and you can see the actual words of it by looking at reading the tablet, and maybe the morning session could do that. But basically, what translated into modern terms, Manashi Sahib is saying, well, which is it? Is it dualism, or rather, is it theism? Is it pantheism? Is it deism, or is it atheism? Which also are, one could say in modern terms, a pretty good summary of the main options available to those who are asking these sorts of fundamental questions. And the amazing thing is Baha'u'llah's answer, because you would think that this is where Baha'u'llah would take the opportunity to announce the winning narrative and say, this is how it is, and the others are wrong. But that's not what Baha'u'llah does. He gives actually really a three-part answer. And his first answer is quite amazing in its subtlety. And the first answer is basically, worry about the needs of the day. His first answer is something like, be anxiously, and we're very familiar with this quotation probably, because it's one of the more famous quotations from Baha'u'llah's writings. His first answer is, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. Almost as though he's saying, don't worry about the theological details. Worry about what is this going to produce in the world, and that ultimately will guide your decision as to what narrative framework to adopt. Baha'u'llah does, in his second part answer to this, say, well, it is clear and evident that the second school, I gave them in a different order, the second school is the school of theism, that the second standeth closer to righteousness. And the word he uses here is taqwa in Persian, which also means God-fearingness. So the way, or the narrative of theism is the more God-fearing narrative, the more righteous narrative. But then the third part of Baha'u'llah's answer, and this is in paragraph 9 of the second tablet, he says, and this is really the real point. He says, one can, however, provide a justification for the tenets of the other schools. For in a sense, all things have ever been and shall ever remain the manifestations of the names and attributes of God. So on the most fundamental possible question, which is the question of the grounding narrative that we take into the world, Baha'u'llah, when asked to basically pick the right one, gives such a nuanced answer. And his answer is a much more, let's say, pragmatic approach than it is a dogmatic approach. He's not saying, here's the correct dogma. Here's the correct way of thinking about the divine. He says, well, there's ways of understanding. There's each of these different schools of thought, and by which we're including the one that effectively is equivalent to atheism. He's saying one can provide a justification for these. What then is the litmus test that one uses to decide which one to adopt? It's, I would argue, ultimately a pragmatic litmus test. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the day in which ye live, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. The narrative we need is the narrative that works. We would like to be able to say that the narrative we need is the true narrative. But the reality is we don't have access to capital T truth. No one does, no one ever will. We would like to believe that the narrative that works is at least aligned with capital T truth. And that would be our assumption, that the narrative that's most effective is also likely to be the one that is most true. We can't be sure of that, but that can be our working assumption. But in the end, all we have to work with is what works in the world. And this is effectively how Baha'u'llah describes his own revelation to Manachi Sahib, and this is in the first tablet. And this is from one of the most famous passages, I think, often quoted, and this is also in Gleanings, so it's translated by Shoghi Effendi. He said, as to thy question concerning the heavenly scriptures, the all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Every age hath its own problem, and every soul its particular aspiration. The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. This is a very different kind of narrative, I suggest, than the way we have traditionally thought of religion. That the world religions, all, I would say, without any exceptions that I'm aware of, think of the revelation of the prophet as being the delivery of pure truth, or as pure truth as can possibly be clothed in the garment of words. And one is then forever looking backwards to that point of delivery. One is forever looking backwards to that point where the words became clothed in the form of a book, as being our closest encounter with the truth, with reality. Baha'u'llah is offering a fundamentally different kind of narrative than that of traditional religious belief. In employing the imagery of the divine physician, this is at its heart a pragmatic and evolutionary narrative. It's one that sees religion not in dogmatic terms, not as something which is fixed for all time, having been delivered in its pure form at a certain point in time, and then the best we can do is stick to what was revealed in the book. Instead, Baha'u'llah says, religion is a kind of remedy for an illness. And as the nature of the illness changes, the nature of the remedy also has to change. And Baha'u'llah goes on in later tablets, as we who are participants in Baha'i community life are aware. Baha'u'llah goes on to lay out the basic principles as to how this remedy can stay active from age to age. And he does it by transferring the power for the creation of laws in accordance with the exigencies of the day to an elected body, a House of Justice, which is able to do whatever needs to be done and has all necessary power to be able to affect the change in the world that is necessary, so that the ultimate goals of his cause can be met in the world. So this narrative I suggest is a powerful and shaping idea. It is ultimately ideas like this, which even more than economic factors, I mean, economic factors, political constitutions, the laws that are on the books, the changing weather, global pandemics, all of these things, of course, are forces in human history. But more powerful still, I think, is the power of ideas. And the power of the right narrative ultimately will be the key to whether humanity can successfully make the transition to the global, the fully global and interconnected society that we believe humanity is moving forward into. Nothing but the power of a new kind of narrative will be able to bridge the incredible chasms that exist between secular ways of thinking and sacred or religious ways of thinking, between Eastern ways of thinking and Western ways of thinking. I mean, we're spending a lot of our time now, so much of the time of that we spend, and our mental bandwidth is spent on problems that are raised by the global media, the problems, you know, for example, and these are very real problems, obviously, you know, for example, in the United States, of this incredible divide that exists between the political right and the political left. All our bandwidth is spent there. There are deeper chasms than that in the world. Deeper chasms that have as yet not received such a great share, I think, of our mental bandwidth that we have yet to encounter, or we've encountered it, but as Peter Berger says, it's still at the fringe and it hasn't made its way to the center yet. And I suggest that one of those great chasms that are still looming and that will be a great impediment to the ultimate unification of the world, if we can't find a way to bridge it, is the chasm between Eastern and Western ways of thinking. The chasm, and one way to put it philosophically, is the chasm between Western modes of thought, both in religion and in science, that ultimately sees the world through a dualistic lens, splits things into this and that, and the very different sort of philosophical and spiritual approach represented in more Eastern traditions, which is more monistic in its approach. There's there is philosophically a vast chasm between dualistic modes of thinking and monistic ways of thinking. What narrative can possibly bridge the divide between those? Is it a narrative that says, well, a dualistic mode of thinking is right and the monistic way of thinking is ultimately wrong? Or the opposite? Or rather, is the narrative of the future something that manages to affirm simultaneously the validity of both what I'm summarizing as Eastern modes of thought and Western modes of thought? I'm going to go into more detail on that in future sessions. but I just wanted to bring that up as an example of the power of narrative and the kind of challenge that the narrative we need is ultimately going to have to face. So I've mentioned that Baha'u'llah has, in his tablet to Manashi Sahib, given what I feel is one of the great keys to the unification of the world, and one of the pillars of the sacred narrative of the future, which is ultimately seeing through this pragmatic lens, which is ultimately seeing the religious experience of the human race as something which cannot be separated from the particular social and spiritual problems of the age in which that religious framework arrived within. And that ultimately is necessarily an evolutionary framework. One way to think about the pragmatic nature of these of the sacred narrative that Baha'u'llah is offering, that I believe Baha'u'llah is offering, is to compare it to, and I think it's really not that far different from the kind of pragmatic narrative that science offers, in the sense that both of them represent solutions to practical problems. Baha'u'llah phrases to his Zoroastrian friend his revelation as a kind of solution to a practical problem, a remedy to a disease. The scientific project can be thought of in very similar terms. Scientific theories, another name for narrative, scientific theories are pragmatic solutions to practical problems. They show you how to get from point A to point B. They show you how, given the following configuration of billiard balls, if you hit the pool cue, the cue ball in this way, this is what's going to happen to the other billiard balls, according to the laws of physics. The laws of physics that are devised are ultimately in reference to solving particular problems. They don't touch upon, just as Baha'u'llah's remedy, idea of religion as remedy, doesn't touch upon the ultimate essence behind it. A scientific theory tells you what to do, how to calculate to make a good prediction. It doesn't tell you what matter is. It doesn't tell you what energy is. It says, well, energy can be defined, can be quantified in the following way, and in the following process, it's transferred in the following way, but it leaves open the question of what it really is. In a way, we can think of both the spiritual narrative offered by Baha'u'llah, as well as the narratives offered in scientific theories, kind of as maps. A map is a very pragmatic device. A map, I'm thinking of just a two-dimensional piece of paper kind of map. It's something that represents a much more complicated reality in simpler terms. It picks the elements that are most needed for the purpose of that map. It throws away all the rest of the details, and you get a sort of simplification of things in a way that makes the map useful. And there are lots of different kinds of maps that can illustrate sort of aspects of both the usefulness and the limitation of maps. One example is, I'll give an example. Actually, I'll share a screen again and just find it on Google. So this is a very famous map that was discovered in the floor of a church in Jerusalem, in Jordan, and this is a map of the ancient city of Jerusalem. And obviously it's thrown out a lot of detail to represent all the city of Jerusalem with a few squares of mosaic tile. But arguably, it's a very fair and accurate representation of Jerusalem as it was understood by people in 400 or 500 AD when this map was created. It gives all the main parts. It gives the main street of the city, the Cardo, including the pillars that defined the space between stalls where the shopkeepers hawk their wares. Apparently there was a big pillar here at the Damascus gate. There's a nice large object here representing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which at the time, because this was under Christian control and before the creation of the Dome of the Rock, this was the real center. You don't even see the Temple Mount here really, but you do see, because this was what factored large in people's imaginations, and how people defined the city of Jerusalem was in terms of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And historians and archaeologists have had a great time identifying various other buildings in this stylized map of Jerusalem, and even made some other identifications. But the interesting thing is, this tells us a few things about maps that I think are the same as the maps that we call religions. They are stylized representations of an underlying reality. As such, they're not exactly accurate representations of that underlying reality. Technically, if you go out and take a surveying tool, you are not going to get this tile map of Jerusalem. But it represents accurately how people thought about the city of Jerusalem and what was important to them. Another aspect of this map is that, like all maps of cities, at least, which are moving and living and dynamic entities, maps can go out of date. They can no longer, at some point, be that useful in allowing you to navigate the city. If you were to take this Madaba map to the modern day city of Jerusalem, you wouldn't get anywhere. It doesn't help you at all. A part of the Cardo has been excavated, and as to the rest of it, it's not going to get you from point A to point B. So maps have a certain lifespan. They are, and one doesn't call it this, but in a way they distort reality, but in a useful way. They allow us to get, they distort reality for the end result of producing something useful. So another example of a map that a lot of people will find familiar if they've taken the London Tube. Here's another example of a map that is also, various versions of it, that's also very useful, extremely useful if you want to get around London. This is, pretty much the way to do it. But if you were to compare this map to the actual street plan of the City of London, you would find huge differences. First of all, these subway stops are not along the straight lines that they're depicted in the map. The left, right, or top bottom relationships of tube stops to each other are not the same. Certainly the distances between the stops are not at all what they are, how they're marked on the map. In so many ways, this map is an absolute distortion of the underlying reality of things. But we accept it as probably the very best way of getting around the city. And we accept the distortions of the map, realizing that it's not the purpose of the map to give us to give us like a surveyor's perspective of the city. The purpose of the map is otherwise. So if this is the case with the physical maps of that guide us through cities, human created cities, in what is it? Could it be in a similar sense that the narratives that we choose, whether these be political narratives, scientific narratives, religious narratives, i.e. religions, can also be seen as maps in a way. They, for a period of time, are helpful in navigating the spaces of human life. And like all maps, at some point, they run out of their ability, or their ability to enable us to navigate these spaces becomes reduced. Sometimes even becomes contrary to their original purpose. I mean, if you took that old map of Jerusalem, you would just get totally lost. I mean, it wouldn't help you at all. Could it be the case that that religions as maps both can become out of date, but also, even when they're not out of date, can we understand them as introducing certain acceptable distortions to underlying reality for the sake of being a remedy, for the sake of accomplishing their purpose in the world?
Steven?
So when Baha'u'llah talks about his faith as being a remedy, that's why it was created. That's why it has the contours that it does. Which means we accept that there may be ways in which it is not a true or faithful representation of the underlying reality of things. Dan has a comment.
Yes. Actually, the world map that we're very familiar with, the Mercator map, is also distortion. The world is round. It's not flat. But the way the map is set up is helpful for navigation, because if you say from this point to this point, you get an actual line that is traversable and gives you a good sense of directions and so on. So it's good for navigation. It's very bad for the sense of the size of geographic areas. That Greenland becomes extremely large, disproportionately. And that is so, depending on what you need the map for, the Mercator map is helpful or it's not helpful. It's a helpful distortion in cases of navigation.
You must have been looking at my notes, because that was exactly the next line in my notes.
Sorry.
But I was you perfectly anticipated. But as I was running out of time, and we're running out of time in this session, and so we'll continue. Where I'm going to go from here is starting to build a new kind of narrative with the idea that it's a kind of a map. As a kind of map, we will accept that it may not be the most accurate way of describing an underlying reality, but we will judge it not on that basis, because who in the end actually has access to reality? We're going to judge it on the basis of how effective is it as a remedy. So why don't I stop there, because it looks like we only have a few minutes left until this session is over. So why don't we take the rest of the time for commentary and questions.
Thank you. Wow, that was a great start. Yeah, I'm entranced already. So I'm just going to have a look. There's a
Thank
question
you.
from Nasreen. Or is it a question, Nasreen, or is it a comment?
I was just thinking of, our smartphone and how it has the navigation on it. So you just put the address in it and it takes you, gives you the where to turn, but then it is up to us when it says turn right to turn right or not, turn left. So we get lost. So it is our choice again. That's how we see the maps and the navigation method.
Hmm.
Thank you. Are there other comments? Grace? Yes, I was, Stephen was talking about chasms, like these different divides among people. And one I think that we just sort of touch upon briefly, but don't really, I think, go into much detail about is the chasm between extreme poverty and extreme wealth. At some point, that is really going to have to be addressed by the world, because it's insane when you have one man who has hundreds of billions of dollars, and then there are lots of other people in the world who are struggling just to get a piece of bread to eat. That's not justice. That extreme is not justice. And last I saw was that if you think it's something like the 26 wealthiest people in this planet have more than half of the world's poorest population, which means 26 people have more than 3.5 billion people. And that's not fair. That's not justice. And somehow that is also because when you have that kind of inequality, it also leads to riots and revolutions and wars.
Yeah. And I would suggest that that problem is not going to be solvable at the policy level. I mean, one can mitigate to some extent, one can hand out checks, like the US government, is right now handing out checks to people, $1,000 or something, just to get them. But that's not even touching that kind of policy-driven redistribution of wealth is not even touching the deeper issue, which is, as we would put it, it's a spiritual disease. And the spiritual disease, and we're going to get into this in a couple of days, I think ultimately has something to do with how we fundamentally orient ourselves in the world vis-a-vis others. Do we see others as other, or do we see the other as an aspect of our own selves? That's going to sound maybe cryptic until I describe it until a couple more sessions.
Thank you.
Hi, Chrisia.
Hi.
Excuse me, Evie, your sound is almost off. You're very hard to hear.
It's because I'm a bit further from my
Evie's
screen.
next.
Okay,
Sorry, was it my turn, Hivi?
Pardon?
Was it my turn?
Yes, it was your turn, Fariba. You were the next person to put your hand up.
Sorry, maybe there isn't enough time, and maybe this kind of thing is better discussed in a workshop. I was thinking about like pragmatism as a narrative, what works. And then I was thinking, so for instance, what works, gosh, I don't even know where I would put unity and the oneness of humankind, whether I would put it as truth, the truth narrative, a grand narrative or a pragmatic narrative that works. But where would metaphysics stand within that? Because for instance, I was thinking of the Buddha. What we have of the Buddha that were a lot of metaphysical questions put to the Buddha. And instead of the Buddha necessarily answering them, he wouldn't necessarily say they were right or wrong. Pretty similar to Baha'u'llah's approach here. He was almost swaying people away from it as if they are not important, because you need to now focus on what's important. It was the virtues and how they need to change their lives. Whereas in the Baha'i faith now we are told, for instance, that the essence of God is inaccessible to us, that the manifestations of God are the closest we can get to understanding God. That the manifestations of God are pre-eternal, that the human soul has a beginning but no end. Abdu'l-Baha, in some answered question, was put so many of these delicate, intricate questions, some of them metaphysical. Do we see all of these as narratives that could change? So for instance, let's say if Abdu'l-Baha says there's no such thing as reincarnation, however we may interpret it, that he says we only come to this world once, whatever lessons we learn or don't learn, and even if we die before we come here, we go to the infinite numbers of the worlds of God beyond here, but this world of tests is only once, etc. Do we see all of this as a pragmatic lesson that we're taught, or is there some truth in there with a capital T?
You're exactly anticipating where I'm going to go in the next couple of days, and this metaphysical ambiguity, I think, is going to end up being absolutely key. And one place that we see the metaphysical ambiguity, as we'll dive into it more, is in the Seven Valleys. Baha'u'llah is talking about the stages of the seeker, but he's really talking, and even more so in the Four Valleys and other tablets in the Call of the Divine Beloved, which came out recently and includes the revised translations of the Seven and Four Valleys. Baha'u'llah is describing different spiritual approaches which are all simultaneously valid. And these different spiritual approaches embody very different kinds of metaphysical frameworks. I mean, one of them is, just to sort of preview the biggest, I think, divide that Baha'u'llah addresses in those mystical tablets. There's a massive division between those who see the world as resolved into different parts and those who see the world as essentially a single whole that, within which the different parts are just aspects. The eye of distinction and the eye of unity. And Baha'u'llah is not saying one is right and one's wrong. Saying these are just different stages in a spiritual path. They all have to be validated in a world that truly embraces its own diversity.
So there isn't necessarily even a hierarchy, you don't think, within the narratives, even within the seven valleys?
That's a great question. Yes, are they situated horizontally or is it situated vertically? And if there's a hierarchy, then aren't we just saying, well, yeah, we will tolerate these lower, these lower metaphysical ways of thinking, but when you really get to the, when you really understand it well, you'll realize that one is true and one is false. In that sense, it becomes a kind of a false. If that is the path that one takes, then the question of good faith comes in. Are we then addressing ourselves in good faith to people when we say, well, it's all equivalent, but in the back of our minds, we're saying, well, actually, my way is in the end really better than your way. And we have to be, I think, careful in coming at it with that point of view, that ultimately there's a verticality, because ultimately that ends up being in tension with a posture of epistemic humility that I think also is being asked of us. As an example of this, at the end of Gems of Divine Mysteries, the Jawahir al-Asrar, Baha'u'llah just nails the point where he says, the seeker, having reached and traversed all of these spiritual stations, if at the end point of the journey, any trace of pride and vainglory should enter into the seeker's heart, at that very moment they're returned to the first stage of the journey without realizing it. So I take that as quite a strong warning against thinking about these things in vertical terms, thinking about things in hierarchical terms, because you never know. You think you're sitting at the top of the knowledge pyramid, and that you have more spiritual insight than anyone else, and you may have just been returned to the bottom of it, and you don't realize it.
Okay, thank you. Cheers.
It's Anna-Grete next. Anna-Grete?
Yes, I'm here. I was thinking that if I had to choose about the maps, I would like to have the new map. I would like to have the one that showed me where to go, and I wouldn't have to go so much inside to the sides, so I could go directly where it is. And that's what I think that the Baha'i faith is the new map. We have to follow the new map to find what's good for today. Also, if you have two cars and the one is old and one is very new, I would choose the new one to driving. So when you say that you cannot about religion, old religion and new religion, say that one is better than the other, but I think the new one is a very necessary. It's very I'm not so good in English. I actually is searching for the words, but if you have to solve the problems today, we must take the best of the maps and the best of the car, and sort of use that for our diseases today.
Yeah, and this is where a posture of pragmatism comes in.
Okay.
We'll end up going with that new map because it's effective, and the effectiveness of it tells its own story. You know, we don't have to say that this is a better revelation than that, or a more full revelation than that. We don't have to take that posture. We can just say, well, if we try doing it this way, look at the results.
Yes.
You know, we have a worldwide community of hundreds of different people of hundreds of different backgrounds, and we're all united in one purpose. Like, who else can do that?
No, that's true. And I think that when the leaders of the politicians, the leader today make their points, and I can give the example of the prime minister of Denmark, Mette. She was standing all alone and taking a moral issue on how to act in this pandemic. She said, one lost person is one too much. And then she shut down, although maybe she would be sort of no, I can't explain it in English, but she could be knocked out for doing it. But afterwards, it has shown that it was very good to do. So I think that, and also the different parties found out they could work together, they could stand together, they could become a unity, could take decisions in united decisions. And I think that's new for the whole world to reckon. Maybe we will fall back. I think we will, but anyway, we have tried it and everybody was happy about it.
Thank you. Chrisia, you're next.
Hi, Steven. So good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, so my question, I did have a question. So yeah, as a person who spent hours in Montreal getting lost because I used the subway map to try to walk around, I think that analogy and the idea of these different types of maps that express different or that focus on different parts of the reality is it's a wonderful analogy for me because yeah, I've lived it. And I think we can get kind of caught up in this idea of just get the map with all the details and then you'll be fine. Like we don't, you don't necessarily want an ordnance survey map when you're just trying to catch a bus somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think when we take that analogy to, for example, for teaching the faith, how do we, it becomes like this kind of line or a gray area of where are we kind of taking the important elements and creating a narrative or sharing a narrative that is appropriate to the situation, as opposed to kind of giving our own interpretation of do you see what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I determine in this situation that these things are the priority elements, and put forward a narrative that kind of accentuates and puts the focus on that. How do I avoid, going into that really murky area where people take what you've said or what you've presented and say, well, you gave me the map, now I'm going to use this for everything. Hi, Catherine, just seeing you there. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. Tough. I mean, because there's no one size
yeah, maybe it's not a question,
answer.
so to speak, but
yeah, there's like different narrative languages that one can use in different situations. And for some people, for example, it would be entirely appropriate to talk about the Baha'i faith in terms of God has sent another messenger with another book with new laws for us to follow. It's perfectly like acceptable to go into it through that doorway. But I think for a lot of the secular West, certainly Europe and the West Coast of America where I live, at best, people are just not going to be interested in that narrative. At worst, they're going to think you're some kind of nut. So where I'm trying to go with this over the next few days is introducing a different kind of narrative that may appeal to those who would not respond to the God has come again narrative.
Yeah.
And I want to do it in a way that doesn't say this narrative is right and that narrative is wrong. I mean, I'm just pulling out a different map. Same city, different map. And so one just has to be aware of the audience to which one is addressing. And that works nicely face to face, or it works somewhat face to face. It doesn't work at all in the internet. And this is where the internet is a real problem, because you don't know who you're addressing, and you may be addressing a room full of people and they're all going to take away a completely different thing from what you said. And they're going to interpret it through their own map, and they're going to see it, and some may respond and some won't. It's like,
maybe that, sorry.
Yeah, it's tough. That's why I think a one size fits all solution, like a one sort of master narrative, may function to some extent. It's certainly simplifying. It's easier to deal with, but you're never going to appeal to more than a slice of a given population if you take the approach that
the benefit of teaching like one-to-one and creating meaningful relationships and conversations.
Yeah.
Okay.